Hello, everybody, and welcome to the panel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is William Alberk. I am the Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, based in Berlin, although the mothership is in London still. And I'm so glad to be on this panel. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, the future of arms control in Europe. And we have an amazing panel set up. To my immediate left, Wyndon Smith, the Director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament, and WMD Non-Proliferation Center, which we named ACDC, just for fun. Oh, yeah, we got to follow up on that. Next to her, Małgorzata Twardowska, the Deputy Director, oh, there you are, hi, of Operations Services at the CPC in the OSCE. In between the two, we have Polina Synovets, the head and founder of the Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation, and all the way at the end there for a little gender balance, Niles Duquet, the director of the Flemish Peace Institute. Thank you all for being here today. So I've been working on arms control in Europe, conventional arms control, since about 1999. So I've had kind of a ringside seat from the Pentagon, the State Department, and then NATO, and now think tank for, unfortunately, the collapse of arms control. And so much of that has to do with Russia's policies, whether it's their continued occupation of Georgia and Moldova, whether it's the unending war against Ukraine. They're just disruptive policies on arms control and security in general. Russia's just been dealing blow after blow to the arms control and confidence and security building arrangements in the Euro-Atlantic region. The withdrawal from the CFE treaty is only the latest episode in this, but we also have probably the impending collapse of the Vienna document as well. Who knows whether they're going to stay in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the end of the Open Skies Treaty, the INF Treaty, systematic violations of the INF Treaty. So the entire edifice of security and stability in the Euro-Atlantic region is falling apart. And with the conflict in Ukraine, just unending Russia's aggression against its neighbors, and how do we maintain a consensus in the West on what to do next? Obviously, NATO's decision to suspend the CFE treaty, an interesting step. We'll see what the remaining countries within the treaty do, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. It's just, it's tough, and where are we going to go from here? But again, I'm glad to have this panel. What I've decided to do in running this panel is, rather than have opening statements from our colleagues, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them the exam questions. We have 4 exam questions. I'll ask each one of them a question. Then I'll open up to the rest of the panel to comment on the answer that we hear, and then we'll open up for questions on that particular question, and then we'll move on to the next question. So we've divided this up, pre-cooked a little bit, the batting order. So the first question is going to go to Polina. So, Polina, how has Russia's war in Ukraine reshaped the security landscape in Europe, and what are the implications for regional and global arms control?
Thank you, William, for such a question. I think that I will not be able to cover all the aspects of it. However, I will start the discussion. Of course, as far as I'm mostly dealing with nuclear arms, I would like to attract your attention to this issue. And of course, the start of the Russia's war against Ukraine made nuclear weapons incredibly popular, not only in the public narrative, but also in the Russia's narrative. And Russia's tried to practice, 3 functions attributed to nuclear weapons: aggressive sanctuarization or offensive deterrence, just covering its regional aggression against Ukraine with nuclear weapons and preventing everyone to interfere in the conflict directly, which was vocalized in the Putin speech on the eve of the war. The second one is deterrence, which of course prevented everyone from physically supporting Ukraine, and the third one is coercion, which partially was successful, especially in the beginning, preventing the West from supplying Ukraine with a number of arms, which could be crucial in the initial stages of the war. However, it was not that successful the longer Russia is practicing this coercive threats, the less they are credible, and this is why this coercion is not that successful. However, coming to the main point, coming to the arms control and the perspectives, what we can see that the main tool of all of these efforts was the escalation. And Russia tried two types of escalation. The one type was the threat of the direct escalation and the attempts to pressure the West with this threat, trying to keep from the supply of the important arms to Ukraine. However, the longer Russia was practicing it, the less credible it was. Plus, after the unsuccessful attempt of Putin to say that Russia will use whatever means available and to protect their next territories, and after the private channeling which took place between the White House and the Kremlin, Putin just stopped this direct escalatory remarks. However, Russia found the other way how to destabilize the situation, and then this is the gradual shaking of strategic stability in the way of Schelling suggested, when you're shaking the boat to the extent that something can happen, something unpleasant, some kind of catastrophe or whatever. So, and it was the direct impact on the arms control. First, Putin suspended Russia's participation in the New START treaty. Then Russia de-ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Then Russia left the CFE. So this is the direct destruction of the strategic stability to show that it will go on with these same escalatory steps. And I am afraid, I mean, maybe I am wrong, I hope very much that the next will be the partial test ban treaty, because if you want to persuade the West, you should make a bright picture of nuclear test at Novaya Zemlya, not the underground one, but the on-site, to affect public opinion in every country of the world, to have this picture all over the world, and then to see how this threat can, what coercive effect it will have on the public opinion. So this is my vision.
So you take the rating and then the exchange between Putin at Valdai and Sergei Karganov very seriously, because he's the one who said they need different layers of escalation, including withdrawing from CTBT, including the potential of a nuclear test, all these things. So do you think Putin's really taking Karaganov very seriously?
I would say no. I would say that Karaganov is, let us imagine that Putin has two ideas in his mind, and he wants to understand what idea is more receptive in the Russian society and in the world. And Karaganov is vocalizing one of the positions. However, Putin still wants to present himself as the only rational alternative in Russia. This is why when Karaganov says, isn't it a high time to change our nuclear doctrine to the more radical one? Putin says, no, this doctrine is perfectly well. So, and then he shows that he's the sanest person in comparison to Karaganov or to Medvedev, who are not the real candidates for the power. However, he shows that there are plurality of opinions in Russia, and Putin is the sanest guy who understands that nuclear weapons is something important and he should be responsible, and that nuclear doctrine works. But again, he is going in this indirect way, not the way of escalating, like really making the conflict, but by killing arms control treaties one by one. And then even if Russia will test nuclear weapons in Novaya Zemlya, they will say it's a defensive measure. We're just trying on our capabilities, and then why not? So we have the right, actually, if they will leave all the treaties.
Well, and that's an excellent point. I think people forget that Russia is a party to the partial test ban treaty, which bans above ground testing and outer space and air. Outer space treaty also bans outer space, but also the threshold test ban treaty. Russia and the US are still parties to that treaty, which limits, I think, to 150 kilotons, something like that. So it will be interesting to see if they withdraw from that. So let me now turn to Nils. Do you have any comments on this question, on Polina's answer?
Yes. And my focus is more on the conventional arms approach, not so much on the nuclear threat. But what we have been seeing in the past 2 years now almost, is that the nuclear deterrence worked to a certain degree, but not completely. And it really had an effect on the conventional arms control issue as well. I think with the threat that was made by Russia to use nuclear weapons, I think there was quite a restrained response from the West. Didn't interfere, respond to the same extent, didn't follow that same nuclear logic, let's say, rhetoric. But immediately it did have an effect because we did not intervene military into the conflict. On the other hand, it did have an incredible impact on what we did with conventional weapons. We started sending weapons to Ukraine first gradually, but under certain conditions, but we are very much involved that way. And I think this is important to see when you're looking at the global repercussions of that. I think there's a lot of feelings of insecurity in Europe that were there latently, but now have become very visible, which has led to much more investments into the military. Military expenditure is going up incredibly. There's much more international cooperation. There's much more focus on developing new weapon systems, which means that it's boosting the arms industry as well in Europe. And to a certain extent, most people would say this will then be mainly focused on its own armed forces and Ukraine, and less export to the rest of the world. But that's only a short-term vision. I think in the long term, boosting the military and the arms industry in Europe will also lead to this industry becoming much more competitive and therefore much more export-oriented in the longer future. And then this is, of course, the big risk, is by increasing the security in Europe, we have to be careful not to decrease the security in the rest of the world, because we're going to see more export. And we know that there are a lot of problems still with export controls in our own European society. And we have to be very careful that we're not going to create more issues, more problems across the world. Because what we're seeing now is that there's a lot of pressure on from the industry and from member states to loosen export control regimes. While when we look back at where it started 30 years ago, back in the day of the European Code of Conduct on Arms Export, this was about security concerns. We have to be very careful not to fall into that trap, because otherwise there will be long-term consequences, not just for us, but from across the world.
Let me turn to Malgorzata. Your job is very interesting as well on the implementation side of arms control at the OSCE. So how do you see the current developments and Russia and the Atlantic area in terms of arms control and your role, which, as I mentioned, the key role of the OSCE in terms of confidence and security building?
Thank you very much. Indeed, the OSCE has a long-standing role in conventional arms control and CSBMs, including the OSCE Framework for Arms Control, which is an annex to the 1996 Lisbon document. And as you're aware, all arrangements have been crippled by withdrawals and suspensions, and we feel that impact in the OSCE very well. And of course, the last year's war also undermined the remaining core pillar of the framework, that is the Vienna document, with its iteration of 2011. So indeed, we see a loosening a possibility to work in the current circumstance. But of course, when times comes, we will be able, as the OSCE, to offer many options for reinvigorating the discussions. So, for example, even on the Vienna document, I can note that even in the weeks and months leading up to the invasion, Vienna document did function as intended, because participating states were afforded 6 different Vienna document-generated engagements to de-escalate the increasingly tense situation, including invocation of Chapter 3 on risk reduction and 2 joint FSC-PC meetings. But of course, as you noted, William, CSBM serve their primary function when there is a will to diffuse tensions, and where a PS or a group of states does not engage in good faith efforts to resolve a situation, what I can see for the role for CSBMs is nonetheless an early warning indicator of a potential crisis. So I don't know if I can continue with how we see prospects for revitalizing
Sure,
the
sounds
OSCE
great, please.
framework
Yeah.
for arms control. Of course, they look very bleak at the moment, but there will be, I'm sure, ways that we can envisage some form of an OSCE track, regardless of the process that will be adopted in the end, because every war ends, and we will have to come back to the table. So there will be a lot of things that the OSCE can do, improving implementation of the Vienna document, so the making more systematic use of the existing provisions, the long-standing process of modernizing based on lessons identified. Then we can also promote application of other relevant CSBMs, such as the Code of Conduct of political military aspects of security, and of course, bolster the arms control framework to improve its potential contribution to a new, renewed European security architecture by even creating a new document, declaration agreement to operationalize agreed CSBMs, delink this package from the current politically entangled processes. So there will be a lot that we can do. We have this also process of structured dialogue, which is a platform for participating states to discuss current and future challenges and risks to the security in the OSCE area. And this can also serve as an incubator for innovative approaches and help form a common vision in the future.
Yeah, I'm just so afraid though that Russia's policy is not risk reduction, but in fact risk amplification. And so, of course, ignoring paragraph 16 and refusing to modernize the Vienna document, which is a big disappointment, because there's the great Polish proposal to turn paragraph 17 into something that's really operational. But all of this also lends itself to the CFE treaty, because if Russia hadn't suspended the CFE treaty back in 2007, we would have seen much more clearly its movement of heavy armor towards Ukraine in 2014, and then again in 2022. They would have had to declare all these movements. We would have had the opportunity for inspections, even if they refused them. But you know what I mean, arms control being that fusion between information they give you and your intelligence, we would have had a platform to perhaps dissuade them, which to me maybe isn't causality that Russia withdrew in order to do these things, but it certainly has been useful. And so it strikes me that the recent NATO decision to suspend full operation of the treaty, I mean, it just makes sense in this kind of operational environment. Why are we giving away stuff to Russia for free when they're clearly not following these rules? So can you give me a little bit of a view from NATO's point of view, what's happening on arms control? What do you think about Russia's actions? And you know, even like Malgorzata, you could look into your crystal ball for the future.
Sure. Yeah, happy to offer any crystal balls. Yeah, and thanks. I mean, the CFE point is certainly one in and of itself, although just rapidly, I would say also, though, that one of the primary purposes of CFE was to prevent surprise. And there was certainly no surprise. Like, this is where new technology, you know, open source and so on. So we had plenty of warning and the ability to engage. So indeed, I think without political will, that's where you see a difference. Let me just thank first the organizers and William for chairing. It's always a pleasure to be here, and having been a part of the prior panel, always really fantastic to be with mixed generations, I'll say. So thank you, all generations who are here. It takes all of us to do this work, and so really excited for that. And then just because you all saw my quick wink at William when we started, I am now the Director of Security Policy at NATO. There is now an Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-proliferation section, but we're working on trying to sustain the ACDC acronym in some way, so stand by.
Congratulations on the new post.
I don't know,
Policy. That's
it's a wider role, but on that note, it does include cooperation with the EU, with our multilateral organization, so all the more pleased to be here. I mean, you asked a bunch of questions. I also, of course, and William knows this well, having sat in my role previously, I have, you know, prepared things to you, but I don't want to necessarily read them. But I do want to provide just a little bit of context, especially because you've asked questions in very clear ways, but I think we've all so far very much focused on Russia. But in this global order and in that future, there are a lot of other players and other factors out there. So from a NATO point of view, obviously our focus is on Russia. and on sustaining the support to Ukraine, both by allied and NATO support. But beyond that, we have China, and China is certainly a rising player with global impact. And from a NATO point of view, we see that as a challenge, and we are actively engaged, continuing to be engaged with the Chinese. And we're seeing indeed some changes from the Chinese themselves on how they're engaging in arms control. And on the topic of, just to keep you all awake, our esteemed Sergei Alexandrovich Karaganov, who we were just speaking about, I was actually on a panel with him at the Chinese Xingshan Forum just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm happy to share some Karaganov stories from sitting next to him. Wonderful experience. But beyond China, we also have, right, Iran, DPRK. We see the impact of that in the current Israel, Hamas conflict. We see that in nuclear matters, missiles, violations of sanctions, the list goes on. New technologies, or really the continuing convergence of technologies, in some cases emergence of technologies, is something we're tracking very closely in this space. And then, as has all of the panelists and William already laid out, just the erosion of the arms control environment overall is something that we're actively involved in. So specific to the CFE treaty, again, NATO itself is not a state party, but the NATO allies who are states parties, and then supported by those who are not, did put forward a very strong statement, and each has agreed indeed to suspend operation, each at different timetables due to their national requirements. So I'm happy to talk about that more, but I do indeed candidly agree that that was the appropriate measure to take, as difficult as it was to take, given that we found ourselves in a situation where Russia was constrained and the allies were not. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the deterrence and defense side. I don't want to, I'm actually going to skip a lot of what I have here, but I do want to go right to, I have some thoughts on what arms control has done in the past and how we might think about that for the future when that moment is right. But let me just give a couple of lessons learned that we came to as a team a bit to share here. There are 4 of those lessons. Some of them are very obvious, but I think just restating it sometimes is helpful from a lessons learned perspective. The first one is that arms control instruments don't prevent war, and they don't prevent surprise necessarily, and they can't impose compliance, but they can stabilize and bring people to the table and do lots of other things. But that first lesson of it's not an end all be all, and I think some in the public expect it to be, so it is not that. And by their nature, by the length of time they usually take to develop and devise, by the time they're in place, the technologies have evolved, the global situation has evolved. Those agreements can't necessarily evolve depending on the type that they are. So there's some important things to think about, that they're not always perfect. In the arms control non-perfection, and still in this first lesson, though, verification remains, I think, a really important thing to think through. And what are the different forms of verification, whether technical or personal or using open source, and there's more and more exploration of that. But even those verification measures, as we've seen with CFE and Vienna document, can be without political will, not sustained. So thinking through the verification lessons within those arms control agreements, I think is quite important. The second is, again, quite obvious, but I think we've got some thinking to do, and NATO is doing work on that, of you have to have a credible partner. We were for some time saying a trusted partner, or you have to have political will. Maybe those are all words that work as well, but I think credibility is the word that we're coming to now, because we have to know that if and when there is an interlocutor, it actually is a person who's speaking on behalf of their government, and that it's not, the play that we already heard from Paulina, is it some stance that's being put forward just to do some horse trading, as we would say, or is it real? And then is there indeed the political will that's part of that credibility, and then the credibility in fact having legitimate issues to put on the table. So there's a lot to think through in a Russia scenario in that case of credibility. And I think we'll have to find our way through to that. At this point, though, we still see that Russia refuses to have dialogue, despite many open doors from NATO, from other individual allied countries. And absent that dialogue, it's hard to build credibility and come to the table in some credible way. The third lesson is that traditional arms control arrangements, and here again I look to many of you in the next generation coming, but they aren't readily structured to address some of these converging challenges. So we've often had arms control agreements that are very siloed, or if they're a more expansive agreement, they have pillars specifically or silos within them. So, there's a lot of great thinking in the think tank communities. Some of them are sitting in this room today about new forms of agreements. Are they qualitative versus quantitative? Are they regional? Are they global? Are they unilateral? Are they political agreements? Are they legal agreements? So there's a lot of thinking that can be done, but traditional agreements from 50, 60 years ago will probably need to adapt, but we need to take the components, again, verification and a few other areas to bring them forward. And then the final lesson, I think, is one that we're still learning, or one that we haven't learned yet, but we need to, which is the role of information and contested information in this arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation space. So in this contested information environment, what do we as the arms control community trust, and how do we verify it in the information? How do our publics understand it and verify it? How do our legislators, our leaders, political leaders, et cetera, technology companies, how are they involved? There's a huge element of the contested information space that's leading us to really think about, the value of truth or fact, and how do you find that in that space. And where NATO is doing some work here is in trust, basically, in data. So when you think about data, not just in the arms control verifiers in the sense of a person and their access in a personal inspection, but also data. So if there are data exchanges, how do we have trust in the data itself? And how do we put an emblem on it and say that it's there? So there's a lot to think through from those lessons. To the crystal ball, I think the crystal ball for NATO is deterrence and defense. So we will focus on deterrence and defense now, in all good reason for the NATO allies and in support of Ukraine. But it will also be with an eye to, there are moments when strengthened deterrence and defense is what actually takes you to arms control, and we see that. And so there is a very strong commitment from all allies to continue to be prepared for that future of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, but do it through very strong deterrence and defense. And then finally, and I think that's a lot of opportunity for questions and discussion here today, is to engage with our partners. So not just the NATO partners, excuse me, of which there are some very specifically across the globe, but those that we don't often engage with, the EU partners, again, both specific and more open academic partners, industry partners. So I mean this very broadly. There's a lot of cross-domain work that remains to be done.
And if I could just come back really quickly with the question, do you think arms control is going to play a role in the end of the conflict, or in the post-conflict situation regarding Ukraine? Do you think arms control has a role to play there, or will this just be like an unending standoff?
So, I mean, I didn't turn it off either. My first reaction is going to sound like a NATO bureaucrat reaction, but I actually mean it as well, which is that how the conflict ends and what agreement comes is up to Ukraine. Yeah. And I fully, stand behind that. So Ukraine has to decide when the moment comes, when it's at the table, if the right interlocutors are at the table for Ukraine or not. But at that moment, I can't imagine a scenario where there isn't some form. Again, if you have a very broad definition of even just, declaration as an arms control measure, or a verification as an arms control measure, hopefully OSCE playing a role, there's absolutely going to be some component. But it's up to Ukraine to decide what that is.
Understood. So I'm going to pause my questions here, and let me take 3 questions from the audience, because I'm sure we've got some great questions. Sir, you had one? We'll get a microphone up here. Can we get a microphone up here? Thank you. This gentleman right here in the front.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the contributions of the panelists. My 2 questions to Director Van Smith. As she is working in the NATO headquarters, maybe there are, many secrets. First question, as we have seen with President Trump, that there is temptation that Americans will withdraw from NATO, and so the European allies will not benefit from the American nuclear umbrella. What are their perceptions? Do they will seek another superpower, or in the opposite, they will think about what the famous American professor, I don't know if he's still alive, Professor Morton Kaplan, who has coined a concept called the unit veto system. I don't know if you have heard about. The unit veto system means that he is for that all states in the world possess nuclear weapons, and so there will be, a real strategic stability. There will be no threat. There will be no aggression. First question. Second question, you have mentioned the conflict in Gaza. What is your perspective? What is your point of view that for the first time since the discovery of the nuclear power, the nuclear weapon, there is a nuclear armed state, Israel, who threatened a non-state actors? What do you think about that? Thank you.
We have a question right there in the center.
Hello, my name is Darina. I'm from Georgia, and I'm a part of the Young Women in Non-proliferation and Disarmament mentorship program. I would like to ask Ms. Smith, you talked about deterrence, and it's one of the priorities to deter Russia up to the war in Ukraine. I'd like to hear your perspective. How would it look like if the American troops will become, instead of rotational, will become permanent in Poland, not in Germany or other countries, but in Poland, given that the southeastern part of Poland transport hub was one of the key areas that was kind of important to deliver the arms to Ukraine. What's your perspective on that? Thank you.
And can we take one more, please?
I'm Mario Rocca, University of Genova. I'm a physicist, so not a political scientist. But my question is to Dr. Smith. You are the main person right here. It's easy to engage into wars. It's much more difficult to get out of them, to have an exit strategy. So is NATO already thinking of what may happen if NATO will lose the war in Ukraine, which I think will be very, very, very probable?
Thank you for the questions. I have to say, I'm certainly glad I'm no longer a NATO official. Poor Wendon. And actually, while Wendon thinks about that, let me first go to the other panelists. Nils, do you have any thoughts on any of those questions? No? Okay. Margarita? No? Paulina?
I have a question in return.
Sure.
Yes, a very important question for me. Is NATO waging a war with Ukraine together against Russia, right? Come on. If NATO was in the Ukrainian territory fighting together with Ukrainian soldiers, there will not be a war anymore. It will be already won.
Thank you, Paulina. And now, Wendon, some really easy questions there, some softballs.
Ukraine resist without NATO weapons? Can Ukraine resist without the supply of NATO weapons?
No, but this is the other question. This is supply of weapons, and the other thing is boots on the ground and sending troops. Russia has, 5 times more human resources, but NATO has more. If NATO sent their soldiers to Ukraine, then it would be a very different picture, because Russia now has the real primacy in the amount of soldiers, in the amount of technologies, in the amount of aircrafts. This is the key question. If NATO would support Ukraine with the boots on the ground, there won't be a war anymore. This is a crucial question.
Okay, Wendon, please.
Yeah. Let me start from where we just were, which could get even more heated quickly, but I'll try and bring us...
De-escalation?
De-escalate. I'll de-escalate. But I do think it's very important to make clear that NATO is providing non-lethal aid. NATO allies are providing lethal aid, and that is a very important difference. So indeed, NATO is not waging a war, and NATO has been very careful to not wage a war, and that could lead us into a discussion of deterrence and self-deterrence, and has NATO or any individual ally self-deterred. But I think it's very clear that Russia has been very aware of where that line is, and NATO has also been very clear of that line, which is why NATO is not providing lethal aid. And as we hear, there are consequences of all those decisions. But I think your question was getting more to planning, if I can say, in general. And so certainly as a political military alliance, but a heavy military core, we have a lot of planners, and contingency planning and preparation and thinking is part of the work that we do. So absolutely, I'll answer very broadly then, but contingency planning can and should go on, and it will, and that's healthy for an organization like NATO. To maybe just go backwards from the questions then to the question from Darina, from Georgia. I'm not sure, you started with a deterrence question, but then took it to the US presence in Poland. So I think you were trying to link the two, although they wouldn't necessarily be linked, but okay. Regarding the US national decision, it's a national decision. Of course, it has implications from a NATO preparedness and training and exercising perspective, but ultimately a national decision, which is something that I won't speak about, and national for Poland, obviously, as well. But the deterrent effect, I think, is where you were trying to get, and how does that deterrent of whether nuclear deterrent or pure conventional deterrence and defense, how does that drive forward given changes in our structure? That has been the theme since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that we continue to adapt that posture. So with the nuclear force, the NATO force structure, all of our work on pre-positioning troops, the increase that we've put from 4 to 8 brigades, and scaling up, all of that work, including any decisions that individual allies make, is part of that just traditional deterrence and defense posture. The nuclear angle is an entirely separate body of work, of course, for very good reason, but ultimately NATO is a nuclear alliance seeking a world without nuclear weapons when those conditions exist. But for now, that will continue. And then to the question on Gaza, I bring it out in the sense of the global effects of instability, whether that's climate or elsewhere, from a NATO perspective. We are fully supportive of abiding by international humanitarian law, protecting citizens, but there's no NATO role in that conflict, but except for us to call for continuing to abide by the norms and international humanitarian law. On the Trump question, I wish I could laugh. I can't. We have to be prepared for any changes in any country. The NATO allies, I think there are 14 allies with elections in the next 6 months, basically, or 10 months, depending on how you count it. Those elections will go lots of different ways. That's the nature of democracy. If any individual nation then makes decisions that affect NATO, NATO will adapt. And having sat at NATO for the last 2+ years now, I've certainly seen that, and I think it will continue to. Where you are trying to go, I think, is on the nuclear topic specifically. And I think that's just too far to go now. I've seen some of the think tanks and others writing about this question of, would the US nuclear umbrella change? That's a US national decision, again, that could be made separate from any decisions about NATO. So I think best to let politics play their ugly or circus course and see what follows. But I have no doubt that adaptation would follow in hand.
Yeah, and on that question about permanent forces, of course, the U.S. has put a permanent core headquarters in Poland, and according to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, it can put up to a brigade on the territory of each ally. So we'll see what happens, especially with whether or not the NATO-Russia Founding Act is fit for purpose. Nils, let me turn to you. Any big lessons in terms of arms control in the conflict for now or for the future?
Well, my research mainly focuses on the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and I think from that perspective there are quite some lessons to be drawn, and quite some lessons not only to be drawn from the Ukraine conflict, but also from previous conflicts in Europe. Right. What we know is that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons leads to conflicts, intensifies conflicts, makes it much more difficult to resolve these conflicts and so on, because they're spoilers. They're always there, and they can spoil any peace agreement. And this is, of course, something of concern. Because we know, we did a study in 2017 on the proliferation of small arms and weapons in Ukraine, following the war in the Crimea, and that was already a problem at that time. Not so much a problem for the rest of Europe, mainly in Ukraine itself, where there was a lot of proliferation and misuse of these weapons. we're now 6 years later, the situation is much worse with regard to proliferation. There are much more weapons out there. We're in a war. There's much less control of these weapons. So these weapons are there, are being used, and will be used for decades to come. Because small arms and light weapons are very durable products. They're very easy to use. Everybody can use them. So this will have consequences for the coming decades, not the coming years, the coming decades. And there's this is a very sensitive topic, also because there's a lot of disinformation from Russia about trafficking of these weapons already going to Hamas and those kinds of things, which is not correct. I think it has to be said very clearly. There are no indications there is any trafficking outside of Ukraine. But this is a concern that a lot of security forces do have, that in the future there might be some trafficking of these weapons, like we have seen in the former Yugoslavia, in the Western Balkans. And the situation is quite problematic still in the Western Balkans as well. There are a lot of weapons being used in the region itself. It's the highest firearm murder rate in Europe. These weapons, these conflict legacy weapons from conflicts that were there 2 decades ago, are still being used in the streets here in Brussels and other European countries as weapons of war by criminals. So this is the concern. And this is not just a concern for the internal security, but especially for Ukraine and for the region. Because let's hope we go into a peaceful peace agreement and that there will be an end to the war. Any group, any individual that feels disenfranchised can start again. They can literally blow up the whole peace process. So this is something that we need to do. And I think there we can draw some lessons from what we have been trying to do from an international perspective, European perspective, UN perspective in the Western Balkans. There have been a lot of efforts being made trying to limit the diversion of these weapons, trying to limit the fact that these weapons can be trafficked. And I think it's very important that we already recognize these risks today. And I think this is what's happening. When you look at the arms deliveries that are taking place, going to Ukraine through the European Peace Facility, for example, there are clear checks, there are clear conditions on how the Ukrainians can actually use these weapons, what they can do with them, how they can transfer these weapons. There's a lot of information exchange. There's a lot of record keeping. So this is risk reduction. This is what we're trying to do already, which I think is very different from what we did in Yugoslavia 2 decades ago, where we were not aware of the problem that much. So I think this plays a very important role. But at the same time, we also see a lot of cooperation on the law enforcement level as well between Ukrainian law enforcement and the European law enforcement agencies, trying to share information, trying to set up cooperation, being prepared for what might come after the war. And I think this is a crucial one because this can have very, very long-lasting consequences. And I think that this is crucial for us because at a certain point, we're going to have to, after the war, be able to take some of these weapons out of circulation again. Sure. Yeah. But how are we going to do that? How are you going to convince people in Ukraine who feel very insecure because of the Russian aggression to give away their weapons? Very difficult process. So we're going to have to implement a society-wide approach where there's much more feelings of security and so on, where we cannot just copy-paste our EU model on firearms possession in Ukraine. It will not work. This is something we've learned. And I think this is crucial. And this is also maybe towards the future, what we're seeing now with the export of weapons to Ukraine and the important role that the peace facility is playing in that and the conditions they're being set. This is very new. That the EU is so involved in arms exports, which is a national competence, is very, very new. And if we are trying to implement all of these mitigation measures already, this could also be a good development if we start expanding this model, not only to transfers to Ukraine, but also to other parts of the world. So I hope this is something that we can learn from these conflicts and actually use that in future proliferation and disarmament initiatives.
That's a great answer. End-use monitoring is critical. The Arms Trade Treaty also plays an important role here in terms of criterion. But also, you mentioned Yugoslavia, and I'm mindful that the ad hoc working group on small arms and light weapons at NATO was set up because of the flows of weapons coming out of the wars in Yugoslavia. And of course, the horrible example that the weapons that were used at the Bataclan were actually weapons that were supposed to have been demilled from the Yugoslav conflict with EU funds, which obviously horrified President Macron to find out. So the need for better EU work and NATO work on small arms light weapons in Europe is going to be critical homework for you in the future. Marco Jadot, if I could turn to you. So you have a unique audience here with the European Union. as someone from the OSCE, obviously not speaking, from talking points, can you give any advice in terms of how the EU can look at arms control in the post-conflict after the war, after Russia's beaten? What would you give advice to the EU in terms of how to use arms control in the OSCE in the future? You touched upon this a little bit, but if you could expand on that. There you go. Oh, one more time. There you go. You got it.
Oh,
Now you got it. Yep.
Thank you so much. And indeed, as a secretary at OSCE official, of course, let me still manage this question. Obviously, bearing into mind or taking into account that actually all EU countries are also members of or participating states of the OSCE. So we are not talking only about the EU itself, but also individual participating states. So obviously we enjoy great collaboration and trust already, and generous EU funding for implementing Salvacy projects across the OSCE region and Ukraine. I would like to echo definitely Neil's point on that. And clearly this sort of collaboration should continue on this topic or another, like you mentioned, governance in security sector overall. But specifically to your question on the EU, for us it's also important because I'm a staunch supporter in network multilateralism, and there will be plenty of work. The division of labor on what can be done in post-conflict environment, because the OSCE is actually very good at post-conflict rehabilitation. We are not good in crisis management. We had SMM in Ukraine during the first war. It was extremely a learning curve for us to have a civilian mission in a conflict environment. So obviously there will be others that will be able to contribute to different parts. But on arms control specifically, I think our perspective at this point in time, and it goes to EU, NATO countries individually or en bloc, we definitely want to see the continued implementation of Vienna document commitments, inspections, evaluations, contact visits, information exchange, even if amongst a smaller group, because that will safeguard the document for the future and will allow participating states to maintain the knowledge and skills involved in verification, evaluation, and exchanges. And of course, they should be also used as if against a potential adversary to maximize the training value for the new generation of inspectors and allow lessons learned to be transferred from the significant cadre of verification staff that are actually approaching retirement. So I don't know if this is the same in NATO. So of course, that's one thing that we can do. There is, as you know, Chapter 10 of the Vienna document on regional measures. So these voluntary measures could definitely be used to the maximum of their potential. And then, of course, this approach will give a stronger standing to efforts in national capitals and reinforce the Vienna document through this challenging period. And that's also sort of a preparation for the post-war period when all countries should prepare the position, the red lines, not wait for the negotiating tables to actually start. And also, even if formal arms control efforts are currently premature, participating states can also use unilateral and multilateral declaration as norm building tools. Because, for example, the US has recently taken this approach with their moratorium on direct anti-satellite missile testing, which is gaining wider support, and their decision to share New START nuclear data with Russia, despite the fact that Russia suspended the treaty. A similar approach is pursued by the UK within the UN system regarding responsible behaviors in space.
Right. Very good. So
similar efforts could be pursued also in conventional arms control field to increase transparency and rebuild confidence. So I would say all these things can be an early stepping stones, really, on which trust can be rebuilt. And as you know, the OSCE is always exactly highlighting that. This is the nature of our organization, non-like-minded. The organization lost its ability to agree to disagree, but I'm sure there will come the time when this platform will be useful and some contribution will be possible by the OSCE as well.
I like the idea of networked multilateralism. I also think networked minilateralism is also very important, because often you need smaller groups of countries rather than just relying on the 57 or the 31 or what have you. But I'm also worried, and I think Wendy probably share this concern as well. After 2007, after the suspension of the CFE treaty vis-a-vis Russia, it meant the number of inspection opportunities for the Allies dropped considerably. And one of the first things that happened was the inspection directorates in many countries has been cut. And now with Vienna document, you know what I mean, with fewer and fewer inspection opportunities, it's going to become harder and harder to maintain, for countries to justify keeping inspectors when they can't inspect. The other thing that really strikes me about the OSCE, that the thing that really concerned me even before COVID, was the increase in bilateral problems. For instance, Armenia announcing that it would no longer accept Azeri or Turkish inspections under any arms control regime. And I fear that, even regional measures, the Chapter 10 agreements with Belarus, all in collapse because of Belarus's role in the war as well. So I am really concerned about the future of arms control, because we just might lose that muscle memory. And, for me, coming from DITRA, inspectors play such an important role in our knowledge of how arms control is implemented in the future. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on either Nils or Magdalena's comments? Paulina? No? All right. Yeah, Wendy, go ahead.
Just one emphasis. I really appreciate Nils' comments on the small arms light weapons work and the importance of it. We do support that from NATO, not necessarily just as NATO allies, although individual allies are as well. But I just wanted to also emphasize on that vein the demining efforts and the humanitarian demining efforts, which are absolutely critical. And already the work is underway through NATO and with other partners as well. But on the NATO partner side, it's been an interesting process, because you see some like Colombia and countries around the globe who've had, unfortunately, experience with mining and demining, volunteering, to help already, because the impact indeed for Ukraine from a recovery point of view is going to be extraordinary. So very much supportive on small arms light weapons, demining, that whole body of work. And then just to emphasize, fully agree on the need to keep the muscle memory, as we say, working for inspections. And there is, I think, some interesting opportunity to hear, maybe from you all as well, but certainly within NATO, individual allies, or as the international staff, trying to think about within the appropriate constraints of treaties. But for example, the Open Skies Treaty has in its opening umbrella statements, it discusses environmental and other considerations for which the treaty might be used. So do we find ways, given the focus on climate, to use those same craft and data and systems and people to do monitoring of flooding or fires, or there could be some appropriate ways. So finding a way that, if it won't be in the next several years, but keeping folks engaged, I think is important. So thank you, and hopefully inspiring some of you.
Well, at DITRA, I recall one way that we kept busy as inspectors was actually small arms light weapons. Going on those kinds of missions and end-use monitoring was a way that we tried to not all get fired during the Bush administration. But I have a question right here. Please, go right ahead.
Thank you. Erik Jørgensen, Aarhus University. Thank you very much for addressing the issue of arms control in the context of the war in Ukraine. I would like the panel to elaborate a little bit, because so far you have addressed the arms control issue as something that can be or should be negotiated and consent-wise. Now, previously in history, arms control has also been imposed. So I would like you to tell us if an imposed arms control on Russia after a just peace has been achieved is a way forward.
And by imposed arms control, you mean embargoes, export limits, things like that?
I mean that, West Germany after the Second World War was imposed for about 30 years on certain strategic arms. And with the CFE, it was something about 100, 200, 300 kilometers, certain weapon types.
Right.
It could also be something about observation, deployed military staff observing along, let's say, the River Don or something like that.
Okay. Can you hand the microphone to the gentleman sitting next to you, actually?
Thanks.
No, I just want to signal a possible precedent for a post-war situation in Ukraine, hopefully. And that is the Florence Agreement of 1996 on conventional weapons in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which the three Bosnian parties agreed on elimination, destruction of conventional weapons in that area. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so next in the back of the room there, we have Lukasz Kulesa, please.
Thank you. Łukasz Kulesa, Polish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to congratulate all the panelists for this very positive spirit of this discussion. And of course, I'm all for devising the post-war arms control architecture. But let me throw a little bit of a skepticism there, because I don't really see a situation in which we would switch from war and confrontation into the time when we would devise a comprehensive arms control architecture for Europe. Even if you have a ceasefire, if you have something that is called a peace arrangement, it would most likely be very fragile. It would most likely not diminish or change significantly the choices that some of the main players in Europe made regarding the developments of the armed forces, regarding their deterrence and defense posture. I don't see a peace dividend coming immediately afterwards, or an urge to actually limit the military capabilities. In case of Russia, in case of Ukraine, in case of, I think, a number of NATO countries, I would see more a continuation of the current trends of rearmament and strengthening their military capabilities. There would most likely also continue to be all sorts of gray zone activities. But as part of this kind of strengthening of defense and deterrence, some of the capabilities and weapons systems that used to be considered a problem, a challenge, destabilizing measures would now be in greater demand. Long-range precision strike systems, deployment of nuclear weapons in additional countries. The Russians and Belarusians made the choice that actually deploying nuclear weapons in additional place seems like a good idea. The ability to move forces around the theater and very quickly mobilize them in a particular space, which used to be a problem and was in a sense this basic thing behind the CFE commitments. Is it still a problem? The Russian strategy was basically, and it's still based on this idea that they are able to mobilize quickly large echelon of forces. Part of NATO's deterrence and defense posture is ability to move forces around. So for me, that's more a picture of a situation in which the possibility for arms control would actually be very, very limited after any hopefully quickly Ukrainian victory and ceasefire. But please, if you have ideas of how would you actually get it restarted, I'll be happy to hear them.
It's a really interesting question. One of the reasons Finland could never join the CFE treaty, for instance, is their entire defense posture is based on massive mobilization very, very rapidly and hidden caches of battle tanks and things like that. So, yeah, the future of arms control is a very interesting question. Bruce, please.
Yeah, but it's on. Bruce Turner from the United States. I hate to take the floor, but I've worked so long on NATO and OSCE conventional arms control, I couldn't resist. But I was thinking of one other lesson I think that we have to learn from the war in Ukraine, is that despite all the advances in AI, cyber, disinformation, all of these things, in the final analysis, this has been in many ways a very conventional war using tanks, artillery shells, drones, and things like that, and it's still about holding territory. So in that sense, I'm confident that there will be a role for conventional arms control when this conflict comes to an end. Thank you.
No, I think that's a great point. I got yet another book at IISS on future war, and reading, that, and how much many of those predictions have been rendered nonsense. It's still about artillery and troops and battle tanks. That's really great. And I have one other question up front before I turn to the panel here, the woman in this section here with the teal top. You? No, her here. I'll come back to you. It's okay. We'll have another round.
Thank you. Margareta Kinenellen from Basel Peace Office and former MP of Switzerland, former head of OSCE PA delegation of the Swiss Federal Assembly. I share very much the concerns uttered by Niels Duque on the spreading of small arms. As a remedy, as an instrument to combat this spreading effectively from the ground, from the concerned population, I think the instrument of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was unanimously adopted after the wars in Balkan and after the war in Rwanda. I think 1325, if women are engaged equally in all phases of the prevention line and then the conflict war solution line, this could be a very effective measure also in regard of arms control. Because you mentioned it, Niels, even after the war for decades, there will be the domestic violence. And the domestic violence was already very high in Ukraine. I was there last time in October 21. It was already very high. And our women on the ground in the Ukraine, on both sides of the front line, are languishing for a time without all these arms. Second point you mentioned, and that's also my question, the boosting of the arms industry. We know very well that the nuclear arm industry did not produce so much some years ago, so they were also longing to produce more. And there are important, prominent American voices who have publicly voiced that Ukraine would be an ideal training ground to test armament technology in view of the real adversary, which is the People's Republic of China. So you alluded to that by saying when European countries are boosting their arms production, the most benefit of the Ukraine conflict is the boosting of the American armament industry. That's where the most profits go. Also of the F-35, etc. This is a big danger which is contrary to any arms control. So these are the 2 points for Niels. For NATO, I want to ask you a very concrete question. Almost all Europe is equipping itself with the F-35 under some pressure. I know what I speak about because Switzerland was going to buy Rafale, but then there was a pressure, you can imagine where from. And so Switzerland, the government turned and is also purchasing F-35. Now, we have on European soil quite a lot of B-62-12 atomic bomb deposits. And we do know that the F-35 are equipped to carry these B-62-12 atomic bombs. Is this the strategy of NATO as a nuclear deterrence? This is one question to NATO. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe still, I have to say something. I left Ukraine for the last time on October 2nd, 2021. And there was a huge exhibit of NATO in Kiev, Borispol Airport. And that's my second question to NATO. NATO, I quote here, NATO seeks to ensure lasting peace in Europe. And my question to that is NATO also accepting SDG Goal 16 to ensure lasting peace by building peaceful, inclusive societies? What is NATO doing to this respect in Ukraine?
Got it. Okay, thank you. Let's start with Nils, because I think there was some stuff for you there.
No, thank you for your two questions. Let me be quite short on the first one. You're absolutely correct that women will be a major victim of the guns that are still going to be there for a long time, as we've seen in former Yugoslavia as well. So I do think engaging women in the peace process is a crucial aspect, not just for the gun issue, but I think for a lot of the societal development. You need the entire population, and you also need to include women explicitly. So I think we're very much on the same point there. With regard to the risks of an increased arms industry, I think there are several risks involved. Not so much that Ukraine will be the testing ground for new technology. I don't think that's the case. But I do think there are different types of risks which are very real. And this is, of course, what we're seeing now is to a certain extent a return to the Cold War, where we have two blocks. The question is, who's part of our bloc? And one of the risks is that if we're going to develop new weapon systems, conventional weapon systems, in first instance for our own armed forces, who are we going to sell it to afterwards? And how much questions are we going to ask about where these weapons will actually end up? And what will be done with those weapons? And I think this is one of the big risks that we have if we go into this Cold War situation again of two blocs opposing each other. So I think we should try to avoid that. The other thing is that, of course, what we are seeing now is that Russia, for example, is using a lot of components in its weapon systems which are not even military products, which are dual-use products or not even dual-use. And they're developing their own weapon systems based on those things. And I think this is, again, a big challenge for us, because how can we make sure that this doesn't happen? How can we make sure that these weapons are not developed with Western components? And there it becomes very difficult, because how can you control all of these components? It's already very difficult to control what's listed as a military product right now and to keep the controls. And how are we going to engage the industry into that process? How can we make sure that the governments know and are capable of controlling what they need to control, but how can we engage the industry in taking up their own role as well, with regard to due diligence, for example, and helping us there? And I think this is the crucial question that we need to ask ourselves today. When we are developing all of these new weapon systems, what will happen with them in 10 or 20 years?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the missile technology control regime, very good at certain things, but what one of my colleagues, IISS, calls the cheap and cheerful drones, the Radio Shack missiles, the low-end stuff is very, very hard to control, and it's becoming more and more ubiquitous on the battlefield. And of course, not just the problem with Ukraine using weapons, but also Russia and Russia's cooperation with Iran, Russia's cooperation with North Korea. What does this mean for the future of missile proliferation as well? Małgorzata, did you hear any of those questions that you wanted to reply to? You got it.
Okay. Well, just briefly to respond to some of those questions, and including I will not answer the question about imposing arms control regimes, because it's also the nature of the OSCE. We are sometimes perceived as teethless. We just have participating states politically binding commitments. So it's actually not possible even in our system. But also, just to comment, indeed, and even despite the nature, our sort of approach is in these three dimensions of security to indeed, when the Paul Mill agenda in the OSCE is blocked, is inefficient, and it's impossible to do. We have to accommodate what will come in the new sort of landscape. What we do is also exactly the work with domestic violence, trafficking in human beings, all these aspects, also environmental impact of the conflict. And this is where the value of the OSCE comes into play as well, where we can sort of also work around the kind of also equally emerging problems. And just perhaps, since maybe my last intervention, because there is always this kind of perception of this OSCE as being, still having Russia. Last week we had the Ministerial Council, Minister Lavrov came, and of course boycotting and what have you. I think OSCE is one of few international organizations which actually has the war in Ukraine as a topic on its agenda on a regular basis. So basically every Thursday at the Permanent Council meeting, no exclusion, Russia is held accountable for violating the principles and commitments and all the atrocities of the war, the suffering of civilians, the non-compliance is brought to the table by OSCE participating states. So I'm really sure that it also plays a role, including all the parts of violations of human rights and the invocation of Moscow mechanism. Thank you.
Now, it's been a while since I've been in the Hofburg, but do the Russians still time everyone else's intervention and then speak that long? Because that's what Anton Mazur used to do.
Well, not necessarily, okay. But of course they do speak a lot. Yeah. So there is, of course, a presentation of the narrative. Yeah. But Russia is definitely isolated in the OSCE, and Russia isolates itself.
Right. Polina?
I also would react on some questions.
Sure.
Yes.
Anyone's?
Not all questions, of course. First about arms control. Well, just one sentence, which is not a response, of course. But I was really surprised. Sorry?
Go ahead.
I'm not NATO. I'm sorry, yes. I'm still very sorry. Yeah, I was just, it just a sentence, just don't mind, I'm not a sociologist, but I was really surprised when I heard about the high level of home violence in Ukraine. Sorry, I have never heard it living in Ukraine for many years. From the moment I was born. Anyway, speaking about the imposing arms control on Russia, I think it could be a very good wishful dream for all of us, because I think that it's possible to impose something like arms control to the side which is completely defeated. And unfortunately, it's not possible to completely defeat the nuclear superpower. So, and then it's not possible. And then nuclear weapons exist just to prevent any kind of coercive steps towards the owner of nuclear weapons. So I think that it's not possible to impose anything on Russia, which Russia would not want to have at some point. And again, it's also somehow connected with my reaction on what Lukasz said. Which I basically agree, but Lukasz said that he would welcome any kind of optimistic, vision. So, with even having like 90% of the pessimistic scenario development vision, we still have this, 3%, maybe 5 or 1, of the situation when Russia would be interested in making arms control, and it would happen in the situation when we will have two conditions. First, Russia will be defeated, and Russia may accept its defeat only in the situation of its authority being changed for the completely different. The ones who would say, okay, we are not about it, we were always against that, we were imposed and we were afraid of the will of the dictator, who is not with us anymore. And then we would like to show that we are open democratic country, and we would like to have arms control agreements. We would like to participate and to be involved in all civilized negotiations. And then we accept, let us say, the border of Ukraine or by the 1991, like that, something like that. So this is 1% chance scenario.
It's an extreme. Please.
Sure. So a lot was asked and a lot I could respond to as well, but I think on the imposition question, simply to say, I concur with some of what we've heard, but I do think there's also ways, and maybe it's a bit of answering Lukasz's question as well, to think about the linkages more effectively. So for example, given Russia's limitless partnership with China, and Russia's changing geostrategic situation as its weapons, particularly in the armed land forces, so less to maritime and air at this point. But anyway, as you look at the evolving situation, and given the relationship with China, there may be broader ways of thinking about arms control that would bring in Russia in a way that is in its interests, but would also be in, when I put my NATO hat back on, in allied interests, in European security interests, et cetera. So I think there are certainly areas where we may have to be very niche on an agreement on X weapon system, which is quite traditional, but maybe there are ways in the future to explore some linkages more closely. And thank you for the precedent. Indeed, there are some maybe to draw from. Lukasz, I'm always happy to talk to you more. I mean, I do think, though, maybe restating what I said before, which is we will focus on deterrence and defense at NATO, but I do think that it's often a position of strength that brings arms control to the table. So it can be that that's actually a mechanism to drive some progress in the future. Granted, I know that may sound to some like I'm calling for an arms race, and I'm not, but in the process of deterrence and defense, I think there can be a positive outcome. To Bruce, I fully agree on the lesson. Thank you. I also would add, I think in some circles there was discussion at the beginning of the war that at the time of maybe the first year or 9 months, we were seeing a war of adaptation by Ukraine and a war of attrition by Russia. And I think increasingly, unfortunately, we're seeing a war of attrition. And the adaptation that the Ukrainians still have been so spectacular with regarding the use of cyber and the nimbleness with which they're operating is still very impressive, but that shift has happened, and we do indeed find ourselves in a much more conventional place. On some of the questions, ma'am, on the F-35 and B-61 and so on, I mean, I think the best way to try and summarize and give you an answer is that NATO is a nuclear alliance, but as I said in the beginning, very importantly, all allies are steadfastly committed to a world without nuclear weapons when those conditions exist. But in the meantime, we will maintain a safe, reliable, secure nuclear arsenal. Again, its policy and so on gets complex quickly, but part of that security and safety is having systems that are appropriate. And so as upgrades are needed, they'll be made. And as conventional support to the military, to the nuclear operations are required, all allies will come forward with that. But as I know, we have Jarmo here in the back. The commitment from all allies to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, to upholding all of the commitments of nuclear sharing arrangements that are in line with the NPT are all very important to allies and will continue to be so indefinitely, I'm quite certain. And then regarding the Sustainable Development Goals and so on, I mean, again, I think it's important to be clear, NATO is a military alliance, but quite rightly, as I said in the beginning, we recognize that security is not just about the military anymore. Security is about environmental security, climate, and so on. So certainly aware of and supportive of sustainable development in all ways. So we have a Women, Peace, and Security unit. We do energy security, environmental security, climate work. We just had our Secretary General at the COP28 meeting. So fully supportive of that 360 view of security that's not just focused on arms and many of the topics we're talking about here today.
And notable the SecGen's representative for Women, Peace and Security, Irene Fellon, a great friend of our office as well back in the day. I had one person back there. We'll get two questions then. We'll get one. Sorry to have cut you off in the last round.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I wouldn't be actually asking a question or giving comment if there wasn't so much of Yugoslavia and Florence Agreement, because I'm from Serbia, Marina Kostić-Rulić. So I just wanted to stress that, and regarding this notion of credibility, it would be actually very hard to sustain the Florence Agreement and the sub-regional arms control agreement when all other countries in the region are building up their militaries and modernizing. So I would just like to ask about this future in general regarding arms control, because without any arms control agreement, Europe is sending very, let's say, dangerous message to other regions. How can you persuade China to have arms control agreement with the United States if you don't have any arms control agreement, or say that everything has failed? So it is also very dangerous for us in the Western Balkans to have all the construction of arms control destroyed, because the Florence Agreement was made according to the CFE treaty, actually. And there are voices now that, okay, we do not have any more CFE agreement, why should we be constrained by the sub-regional arms control agreement? So that is a big issue. That's one point. And my other question is regarding the NPT. Is the NPT next? NPT is the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime. Are we questioning now that last norm, let's say the non-proliferation norm, and is the NPT the next victim of all of this situation, which will be very, very dangerous? And I think that we are on the edge of the new proliferation crisis. So it is not only about the Europe, it is about the whole world. And I want to thank to Niels for pointing that at the beginning, that by this modernization, maybe we are getting in danger, actually, the whole world and the instability in the world. Thank you very much.
We have time for one more question, so please, if you could.
Commending the panelists, I have written an article with interested. NATO has non-compliance with the NPT Article 1 and 2. Those NATO's, I'm saying NATO as a whole, and US, of course, and 5 countries who have the nuclear weapon in their countries. Now, what is the consequence of the Ukraine crisis? We were all years trying to convince that this deployment of US weapons in the 5 countries not only is violation of the NPT, but this is dangerous. Now the taboo is broken and Russia has done so. Therefore, this is what is the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. And we have to worry about maybe China will decide also to have another country's deployment. I think this is the concern of all of us as non-nuclear weapon states, that this is a very dangerous trend which has triggered after NATO. The last, not the last. I hope that there would be in a meeting that there would be Russians or somebody at least to talk. We are all talking about Russia, the most perhaps saying, and nobody is there here to say so anything. But I was the only one after the Ukraine crisis in Diplomatic in Vienna. I stood up, I said, could you tell somebody at least talk about the root cause, whether the provocation by NATO has had an impact, some impact. I think that we have to be pragmatic as a scientist, as a diplomat, or as academia, because we have to give the right message to decision makers not to make miscalculation and create this bloodshed. Of course, if we are very pragmatic, and I hope that we can do it, and this kind of excellent gathering will be, but next time, perhaps next year, I don't know, hope by then the Ukraine crisis is over, but invite the Russians also to talk about at least their position. Thank you.
I'll also have to give you my paper for IFRI on NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements and the NPT. It's not incompatible at all. In fact, the US and the Soviets drafted the treaty. And the Soviets, let's not also not forget that the Soviets actually had nuclear sharing with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. So unfortunately, it's a reversion to mean, oh, there we go. All right. So really quickly, any final words from the panelists? Niels?
With the risk of repeating myself and my colleagues, but I think what we have to take away from this session is that arms control has to be part of the solution. It's not going to be easy. It cannot be imposed. It's going to be a very long process, but it's not enough. And this is something that's also been said. We need to do much more than only focus on weapons. We need to have a comprehensive approach, looking at the civilian part of peace and security as well. And there, the EU can do a lot more. Member states can do a lot. OSCE can do a lot. I think that's the way forward. But in getting there, it's very difficult. There's a lot of challenges that are still out there, specifically for the EU. How do you deal with another side that you cannot trust? Right? How do you deal with that? How can you negotiate with them? It's very, very difficult. How can we make sure we have shared perspectives within the EU, which is also not self-evident? And we also have to show the image of wanting peace, which is not always so easy if you're also delivering weapons at the same time. And finally, if the EU wants to play an important role in creating peace within arms control and other issues, I think you also have to have the legitimacy. We are supporting Ukraine because of international law, which means we also have to have a clear condemnation of every breach of international law. And this has not happened in the past and is not happening today. And I think this is a crucial aspect.
Thank you. Małgorzata?
No, I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Amen.
Polina?
2 points about the NPT survival, because there was a question. I think that, why the NPT could collapse today, it's because the interest towards nuclear weapons is raised tremendously, because nuclear weapons can provide power projection for many states who are cherishing some plans of invasion, and now they know the good recipe, as Russia is making nuclear weapons as the umbrella for its aggression, right? So this is why I think that the destiny of NPT will be directly connected with the results of the war in Ukraine. If Russia's nuclear coercion will not be successful, then nuclear weapons will come back to the role of just pure deterrent tool, which is not effective in as a tool of political manipulation. If it won't happen, if Russia's nuclear coercion will make the West to step back and to give up Ukraine, then let us wait for the collapse of the NPT next, maybe. The other, very short reaction is that I would prefer probably that many of us would leave that definition, the Ukraine crisis. This is not the crisis of Ukraine. This is the invasion. And again, when we are saying that anything Russia's invasion of Ukraine was provoked by NATO, it's the same as telling then when some criminal is being prosecuted, then to tell that he's not guilty. It's his father who was beating him 20 years ago. This is his fault. So let's forget about the fault of this guy, right? Is it just? I mean, how about the victim? It's not justified. Nothing is justified. This is the aggression. And we are living in this situation. We should not think about what happened before. Who is guilty? The one who is making the aggression, he is guilty. This is the simple question. Thank you.
Wendy, final word?
Yeah, difficult to summarize, but I mean, I can't not just emphasize what you said, William, that indeed all of the NATO nuclear sharing arrangements are fully consistent with the NPT, and happy to point you to many articles, including the most recent one, but many historical elements as well. But also to say that the consistency with international humanitarian law and calling out violations, I fully agree. I think the need to remain responsible, calm, defensive, all of the things that NATO has been during the Russian war against Ukraine, but in many other conflicts as well, will continue. And then maybe just to try and close on a positive note, if Lukasz will let me. I mean, I do think that this type of forum and the ongoing work that's being done in think tanks and in multilateral organizations and individual allied nations and other nations around the world is really helpful to prepare us for that future. I mean, we need to see our way through the war. It needs to end, and there are many other factors at play in the world as well, but it is the time to be doing the thinking and challenging each other and having these discussions so that we can be prepared when that future comes. And then to make that feasible, I'll kind of close with where I started, which is, again, thanks to the EU for hosting, but the engagement between these types of partners, and I mean partners, again, very broadly, players, industry, academia, EU, NATO, OSCE, Africa Union, League of Arab States, like the list is very long. And it needs to involve all of us in its appropriate ways in order to find ways that will work, because it can't be a one-sided approach that will find us in a good future.
This is a great place to end. Sorry, I know there's more questions, but that's why we have a coffee break until 16:20. Can I please get a round of applause for our wonderful panelists? You've earned your break. Thank you.